um, the dams portion of our Kittacuck restored project, basically working on a larger hydrologic model of the Black Sand system in order to inform our potential restoration projects. So just a quick overview of what I'll go through. I'll go through just the scope for the project and what we've done up to this point. Talk through the 10 survey sites that we included as part of our scope, and those inform our modeling scenarios. So a large amount of time will be devoted to kind of going through the different scenarios we're looking at, looking to model and kind of getting some input on that. And then we'll have some built-in time for discussion, and talk through some of our next steps for the project. So before I get into what an H&H model really is, just like the zoom out big picture of why we're doing this model. So we developed this model of the Blackstone River to inform potential restoration projects. So that includes dam removals, widening bridge crossings, any sorts of work related to the canal. Essentially just to inform how those scenarios would impact the river. So I'll just go ahead and acknowledge there are so many stakeholders on the river. Um, Everyone has some sort of different, interest or priority for what they're hopeful for a project to become, including ecological restoration, maybe recreation or history. So just to kind of focus the intent of this, it's really just to inform future decisions, and give us something to talk about when we talk about what these different restoration projects would entail. And that's a word I'm throwing around too a lot, restoration. So when I say restoration, I kind of mean it in this ecological restoration context, which really has to do with restoring a river's function, more than necessarily looking at any specific like era of what the river was and restoring it to some sort of historical context. So with that, this might be overview to a lot of people. Um, might seem familiar, but just so that we're all on the same page, let me just define what an H&H model really is. I think we hear that term all the time, and unless you're deep in the stuff, um, you might actually be wondering what H&H means. So the first H is hydrology, and the second H is hydraulics. Hydrology really just means the volume of water in a river, mostly derived from precipitation, especially in Massachusetts. It's not like we really get too much like snow melt like out west in the Rockies. It's really mostly like it rains, and it goes through a watershed and enters the river as flow. And so a lot of how much flow ends up in a river is impacted by the amount of rain, intensity, but also the land cover of its watershed. So if it's a really urban watershed, or if it's a really forested watershed, you're going to see a different sort of hydrologic response in the river. You might get a lot of flow at once. You might get it breaking it over a long period of time. So that's hydrology in a nutshell. And then hydraulics is more about how the shape of the river um, interacts with that flow in order to control things like how high the water gets, how fast it moves, um, deep spots, things like that. So for this current project, we were looking at the main stem of the Blackstone River. Um, Basically focused on the main stem, just given the inherent limits of time and budget to complete a project. And even with the main stem, we had our hands pretty full. So we started by just reviewing everything along the main stem in terms of sort of like human alterations. So that includes 22 dams, 76 bridges and culverts, mostly bridges, and over 7 miles of canal that basically run parallel to the Blackstone River. So we've already completed a sort of information and data review. We spoke to that at the last stakeholder meeting. And we also have completed some field work of 10 priority sites that were identified. So we surveyed these sites a day at each site, summarized that in a memorandum, and worked with the Blackstone Collaborative um, on that, and just sent that over about a month or two ago. Um, and so now we're kind of in the more of the H&H model development part of the project. So that's kind of like the meat of it, in a lot of people's eyes, is actually using that fieldwork and the information we gathered in our data review to start to inform these modeling scenarios, which I'll be talking more about. And we're also just doing engagement meetings. So this is an engagement meeting, but our steering committee getting any sort of information from all the stakeholders at play is really invaluable to the process. Um, so before I go through all of the different sites we looked at, um, just kind of an overview of how we thought about restoration sites. So there are kind of three main types of sites that we looked at. The biggest one was dams. So dams, where they're feasible to remove, offer a really large potential for restoration of a river system. Um, Dams, probably more than anything else, really fundamentally alter the hydraulics of a river. So slowing water down, um, causing it to, basically fill up a large area of floodplain, and preventing continuity of recreation and also ecological habitat continuity. So that was a really big type. But we also looked at other opportunities to bring back natural conditions of the river. Um, so places where the river leaves its main channel basically into or out of the canal, that's of note, especially because there are times where the river actually runs dry, but there's water in the canal, which seems a little bit counterintuitive from just a river sense. And the last one is bridges. So any bridges that are pinch points are something that we were kind of interested in looking into. Um, and then that kind of feeds into our types of scenarios. We looked basically across the whole river, and I'll get more into these types of scenarios in the bulk of this presentation, but um, looking at kind of like a baseline condition across the whole river, we also looked at the different dams, um, and looked at basically full removal scenarios, partial removal scenarios. For bridges, we looked at opportunities to widen the bridges and eliminate like choke points, like I said. Looked at any places where the canal and the river were interacting and ways to modify those. And otherwise, any sort of structures along the river, ways to like remove or modify those structures. So, that leads to this long list of sites, which I won't read through now because we're basically going to look through them in all of the potential modeling scenarios. Um, but as you can see, we basically went out and surveyed about nine or 10 um, dams, as well as some canal river connection points, which all fed into our H&H model. Um, and that leads to this big list of scenarios. So I'm gonna basically pause here and say, now's a great time to ask any preliminary questions before we really get into looking at these scenarios. Um,
Any questions for Jonas?
Yeah, I had just a general question about removing bridges. I would guess that's a monstrous process. And how much does the constriction, the pinch points caused by bridges, how much does it really affect the sort of natural ecology of the river? as
Um,
opposed to dams, which are more obvious.
yeah, it's a lot less so on the Blackstone, especially the main stem. Um, a lot of the time, bridges are like undersized culverts. Those will have larger impacts on like usually tributaries or smaller rivers. Um, and that's where, especially from like a habitat continuity standpoint, like you'll see culverts or basically pipes, where instead of a bridge, you just have a pipe running under the road, and those can be major points where like a lot of fish or other critters can't get through it. And also, you can imagine if you're trying to squeeze a whole river into a pipe or a culvert that's too small, that can cause a really big backup, which basically has the same impact as a dam. Um, there wasn't really anything like that on the Blackstone, but we do have some cases where adjacent to a bridge, usually upstream of the bridge, you see that the floodplain gets a little bit wider, and so this actually relates more to flooding. So, in some cases, a bridge will just be narrower than the natural like floodplain um, of the river, and that still creates a pinch point for those larger flood events. Think of like the 100-year flood, the FEMA regulated flood. That has a harder time squeezing into a narrower bridge, and that can be when it starts to interact and have a negative impact.
Okay. Yeah, I was thinking about bigger bridges, but I guess the bigger would still represent real constrictions in general. Yeah, there's one in Uxbridge I know on Hartford, yeah, it's Hartford Avenue, which is a real constriction point that you didn't list, but
Mhm.
certainly you added
Well,
now.
I mean, that's great to kind of think through some of these spots because
Yeah, yeah,
if I haven't mentioned it, like this is our 90%, let's say 90% list of scenarios to model,
gotcha,
and I'll go through
gotcha.
each of these, but especially like the
Sure.
bridges, if there are any that we are not showing as like potential constriction points,
Yeah,
um, we're not necessarily married to those as scenarios.
gotcha. Okay, thanks.
And just to clarify your first part of the question, David, we're not proposing to remove bridges. We're just proposing to widen bridges to meet stream
Yeah,
crossing standards so that
yeah,
it
yeah,
doesn't
yeah.
create a pinch point.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
Peter?
Yeah, Stephanie, that was my question about, you said widen to meet standards. And I noticed that Providence Street Bridge, North Bridge is on that. And so my question was, is that just widening the bridge or you're saying widening the crossing? Because the state just did that like 5, 8 years ago. I would have thought they would have brought it up as much as possible, but
Um, Steph, unless you want us to jump in, I can at least clarify the piece of that where it says standards. I think that's a sort of abbreviated version, and this is maybe on me and my team for getting in our fish zone or river zone and not really thinking about um it's not all common knowledge. So that refers to the stream crossing standards in Massachusetts, which is um a specific criteria for like thinking about width and overall dimensions of a bridge. It has less to do maybe with like um, FEMA flooding or even like other transportation safety standards. So if that was like a transportation project to make sure a bridge was up to like infrastructure standards, that's not what we were referring to with that proposed description.
Yeah, and I know Providence Street it is an area where a lot of flooding occurs above that bridge. I'm not sure that's part of this modeling effort to understand how much of that is the bridge versus how much of it is we built in the floodplain, so the floodplain's going to flood. So we need to, I think, understand that a little bit better to see if we did widen it, what would happen? Would it alleviate some of that flooding, or would it not make a difference?
Anyone else? Those were definitely helpful clarifying questions.
Jonas, I might have missed this in the map that you showed in the last slide, but did you just pick a selection of dams and bridges to model, or did you look at all of them?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I kind of glanced past that. Part of our whole information and data review um, essentially led to the selection of these 10 sites. And so we basically recommended around 10 sites from reviewing all the different dams, bridges, locations where the canal interacts with the river, um, and identified dams that were feasible to take out, but also, we kind of think about all these factors, feasibility, restoration benefit, um, current fish passage ability, all of these different items in order to kind of identify what we thought were the best. I should say sediment contamination, sediment quality, was obviously a really big one. So kind of using all these factors to recommend 10 top priority sites. And then at some past stakeholder meetings as well as other engagement meetings, try to garner some input, make sure that we're on the right track with the ones we were thinking about. Some had been in the collaborative's view and in the even like past assessments, past reports along the river had been some like already identified dams or other locations on the river that were um, considered good spots for restoration projects, but hadn't progressed much past that. So that was a big goal. Some even had some feasibility studies, and it was about taking them a little bit farther too. So that's how we got to those 10. Um, it wasn't just us kind of picking on our own.
Okay, and so maybe I don't really understand the full purpose. Like that makes total sense. So when I think about an H&H study of the whole river, are we gonna have like a report that's gonna tell us how the river flows? Because I know, like you said earlier, sometimes during droughts there'll be water in the canal and not water in the river. Is the H&H more, it sounds to me like from what you're saying, the H&H is more driven towards restoration of specific sites versus understanding the hydraulics of the total rivers. Is that right?
Um, You're asking really helpful clarifying questions, Kate. So one of the other goals of this project, I've been talking mostly about the restoration sites, but a big goal is to understand just the hydrology, hydraulics of the whole river, especially because of these sites where like the river would be dry, the canal wouldn't be, and kind of understanding how the canal and the river are interacting. So that's something that we're building into the model just from an existing condition standpoint. For the,
Okay, so it's
yeah,
both.
yeah, so it's both.
All right, all right.
Yeah.
Thanks for clarifying.
Yeah, thanks for asking. Any other questions? Those were all really helpful clarifying questions. Okay. I'm gonna jump into these scenarios. We'll have time for questions at the end, but if anything is unclear, please, please, please just ask what the heck do you mean, Jonas? Because again, I can get into river H&H modeling mode by accident and not realize that I'm not really being perfectly clear on what I'm describing. So, and I'm also just familiar with these sites from kind of surveying them. So if I'm anything seems unclear, please just jump in. We have a list of 20 potential restoration um, projects, sites, and we're looking for feedback essentially saying, yes, you're on the right track. Um, no, uh, you're way off the right track. You're on the wrong track. Um, and as a reminder, a lot of this is just to kind of answer the questions of like, what would be the impacts, right? So even if something's totally, or is pretty infeasible, or maybe against what you are interested in, but it's feasible, we just want to explore what the impact would be, so that we can have it understood. Um, So with that being said, we'll jump into it. I'm going to start big picture, and that's with essentially some kind of baseline scenarios across the entire main stem of the Blackstone. So these baseline scenarios are basically to assess some what we would consider natural, almost like no human impact conditions of the river, as much as that's like possible to try to approximate with a model. So we kind of broke this across three different steps. The first, and I'm gonna say this as kind of in terms of like how the model works, not thinking that anything is actually feasible. It's just sort of like getting our baseline. So in our H&H model, which is it's the this program HEC-RAS, which some of you may be familiar with, um, we've already built in all the dams, the bridges, how the canal interacts. And so the first scenario would be just to take the dams out of the model and basically say, what are the water levels without any dams in the river? What would a damless Blackstone actually look like from a hydrologic and hydraulic perspective? Would water levels be lower? Would they be moving faster? How would flooding be lower? Um, and then we built that up to our second scenario. Um, what if there just weren't any bridges crossing the river? So any of these points that might be choke points, if those weren't impinging on the river, how would that affect flow? So just like with dams, letting us kind of compare what the maximum flood levels can be, um, taking out these choke points, if we kind of see a difference between our existing conditions model or any of our scenarios, and this sort of no bridges scenario, that tells us what's the maximum potential for like how much we could make essentially all this human infrastructure. How much could that be invisible to the river if we had built it in a way where we're not, our infrastructure isn't causing flooding to get worse, etc. And then the last step of that is to actually remove the connections between the river and the canal from the model. So imagining that there are no locations that the river can leave its main channel and go into the canal. And again, this is just to understand how much is the canal affecting the hydrology of the river, how much is it diverting flow from the river, and so we can get a better, baseline understanding of what would that river look like. So again, this kind of serves as the baseline. Um, we compare it to our existing conditions to understand how much human infrastructure has affected the river, but we also use it to understand how close our restoration scenarios get to this maximum, um, I guess, possible restoration of the river. Not that it is really feasible, but I guess maximum natural conditions. Um, I'm gonna I'm gonna pause here just because that one might not be intuitive. So if any folks have any questions on this one, happy to explain that a little bit more. Okay, I'm not hearing anything, which is either a good sign or everyone's totally lost. But I'll just keep moving for now. Um, so next we'll move to actual sites, and so these are going to be a little bit more tangible. But we're going to start this whole thing from upstream to downstream. So starting up towards the headwaters in Worcester, we're looking near the uh, visitor center, the Blackstone Visitor Center, at the Quinsigamond Village Dams. Um, and so here's some photos from our site work. Hopefully you can see my cursor moving around. Yes, see some nods. So the Quinsigamond Village dams are basically two dams right by the Blackstone Visitor Center. So there's this lower one, which is what we're looking at in this picture. Not too tall, maybe 4 or so feet tall. Um, and then an upper dam upstream of that lower dam, which is a bit taller. It's basically around the corner in this photo, so you can't quite see it, but you can kind of imagine this photo is from standing like up there, looking that way. So right around there, a little bit taller than this dam, um, and the dams have different ownership. This lower dam is actually kind of older, and I think the owner is not exactly known. So we kind of split up two more scenarios. We're continuing the count at 4 and 5. So the first scenario is just a simpler, removing this downstream dam, and then scenario 5, removing both dams. Um, just based on the lower one being slightly more feasible from a level of impacts standpoint. It's a little bit more isolated and smaller.
And maybe
Uh,
just to jump in really quickly there, just as you said, we don't technically know the owner of the downstream dam. I've heard from DCR that it's probably theirs, but they're not sure about that either. And I think that probably we could go through some old data, especially when they built the visitor center, and figure out if that parcel is part of it. So it's likely DCR, but not for sure. Whereas the upper one we know is the city of Worcester, but we know that they've put in some funding and efforts to retaining that dam and fixing it as well.
Thanks, Steph. Okay, I'm gonna move to our next couple. So now we're moving downstream, and we actually have a really tight cluster of a lot of dams together. So we're gonna keep looking at this general graphic, but the first one moving downstream from Quinsigamond is the Millbury Electric Dam. Um, so that's in Millbury. Um, and you can see it's basically this like stone block, stone masonry, and also some stone cobbles. Um, Dam. Um, there is a bypass channel with a flow control structure, probably a legacy of whatever industrial use the dam was originally built for. This is a pretty simple scenario of just removing the dam, and in all likelihood, the flow would just continue down the main channel, so we didn't really look at any additional um, pieces related to that structure. Next downstream, Wilkinson Dam down in Sutton. So here's a photo looking kind of from this spot in this parking lot towards the dam. Another pretty small dam, only about 1 or 2 feet tall. It's also stone blocks and large boulders. Um, and this one is also a pretty simple scenario of just removing that dam. It seems like there might be the remnants of another dam downstream, but at this point, that dam is just fully kind of disassembled to the point that it doesn't really impact flow over it, or habitat connectivity, recreational connectivity. So, not focusing on that downstream one, just focusing on this upstream one.
And one other point there too, we recently, when we did a site visit with the state DER, they thought that that might be something that USGS put in as to help with the flow gauge to make it more level flow, a weir. And so they said, don't call it a dam, probably, but there might be an opportunity to speak to USGS about that one.
Oh, that's good context. The next downstream one, Saundersville Dam in Grafton. So this one is an interesting one. It basically has like a staircase, stair step type shape. And it's actually already has partially breached. Um, where kind of this photo is basically looking downstream from this bank towards the upstream. So you can kind of see there's this breach on this eastern side. Um, and then there's actually also a sort of bypass channel um, farther east. And there's sort of a structure with gates, like wooden gates in the river, wooden boards, I should say, that helps control water too. That's kind of a bypass channel, and it goes through a series, a culvert. So we did split this into two additional scenarios. So one would be removing the entirety of the dam, but not really touching that bypass channel. And then we also are proposing looking into that bypass channel, removing that structure, and just seeing does that have any additional benefit? Would it be beneficial while you're doing that work to do additional removal and restoration? The last one in this area is the Arnhemsville Dam. Um, so that is really a series of two or potentially three dams. Um, this photo we're looking at, it's basically from standing on this bridge, looking upstream, you can see there's basically a lower and an upper dam, and that shows up pretty well in this picture. They are crib wall dams that are essentially partially breached already, stone and wood crib walls. Um, Flow can get through, but it still is not truly connected in that if you were in, say, a kayak, you would not want to go down this unless you were very good at whitewater kayaking. Um, and you can see how flat the water is upstream of there, so that there's definitely some impoundment effects from this. There's probably a total of maybe 2 to 3 feet of actual height gain from the dam. Um, and then farther upstream, kind of interestingly, there's the remnants of a stone wall and another sort of submerged dam that it might just be submerged because these lower dams back up water so much that it just backs up and is underwater here. But something we want to look at is our first scenario would just be removing those two lower dams. Um, but we're interested in seeing if you remove these dams, is it lower water levels so much that this upper dam actually starts acting as an active dam again, holds back flow, creates another sort of impassable point. So do we need to also remove that dam and maybe the stone wall too? So that's two more scenarios. We're already at 11 scenarios towards our 20. Next up, this is not a dam. This is looking at this breach in the berm separating the river from the canal, kind of near Plummer's Landing. So Plummer's Landing and North Bridge is right here, this sort of bridge crossing. And so just downstream of that, maybe 2,000 feet downstream, um, is this breach, and here's kind of a better look at it. So from the aerial, you can see the river channel, which kind of bends through here, flowing downstream north to south. Um, Over time, the power of the river eroded that berm that separated the main channel from the canal. And so you can see actually if you're a Google Earth nerd like me, you can kind of do this time rewind and see how over time the berm wore away, eroded away, and now they're disconnected. And this is the spot I was referring to earlier when you can see um, flow in the canal, but not so much in the river downstream. This is one of the spots we know that happens. Um, so we have two scenarios proposed here. Um, One is basically to just rebuild that berm just like it originally was. Um, and so just reconnect that earth in pieces, fortify it so that it was less likely or has some longevity to against breaching again. And kind of just, yeah, restore it as it was. And then a second scenario, which is just kind of considering longevity of restoration approach. We know that the river is going to continue having force pushing against that spot on the berm. Um, it's it's trying to make that turn, and just naturally that's put its force against that berm in order to make the turn and push the water back that way. So an alternate approach would be to kind of build the blockage or repair the berm more in a diagonal fashion and essentially block off flow into the canal and just build up against the berm. And if you built it deep enough back against the sort of original bank of the channel, um, that could be a stronger fortification. It wouldn't have a pocket of water that it could breach into in the same way, which might give it more longevity than just staying in the river. Um, so just to understand that scenario, we could look at those two different versions of it.
And just to note that this is not the only intersection of the canal and the river. This is just one that was not supposed to exist originally when they built the canal. It was always supposed to be canals over here, rivers over here, and it just has eroded over time. But south of this, within a quarter of a mile, maybe even less than that, the river and the canal do intersect a couple of other times. And so the flow is sort of regulated itself to be enough water for both at those lower points. But at this point, it does create more of a problem because it hasn't been that way for very long. We think it was, um, for folks who live in that area, they think it was a mid 1980s storm that originally started eroding this and creating this issue. And so right now, the river does run quite dry just below this area. And it also erodes the canal very badly, excuse me, which is, historic, and also it threatens to expose the town's sewer infrastructure, which runs along the banks of the canal. And so the town's really concerned from that perspective as well. There's also development just immediately west of this. You can kind of start to see it on the bottom left of this picture, um, where there's an opening there. So if that development is within like 500 feet, if something did happen here, if it flooded, if there was that sewer break, et cetera, that large scale commercial development might be impacted. So there's a lot of other factors at play with this specific site.
Thanks, Steph. Okay, I'm gonna keep going to our next one. So if you keep going downstream, down in Uxbridge, we have what we've been calling the Route 16 Dam. It's basically just south of the Stanley Woolen Mill, for folks who are familiar. Um, and so it's essentially, and I think the photos will do the best job kind of looking at this. It's something that you could have never noticed before in your entire life. It's basically just past this, just south of this bridge over or along Route 16 over the Blackstone. Um, and essentially 2, maybe 3 feet of boulders that create really seems like just a whitewater feature, but is actually the remnants of a dam. This dam is um, perhaps like old enough and has been breached long enough that it's not even listed as like a non-jurisdictional dam in the state's registry. Um, but it definitely has some impacts. You can see this was a pretty high flow. If you were trying to go on the river recreationally, you really wouldn't want to go down that. And it probably creates a barrier during some flows for fish passage too. So um, not necessarily a significant dam in terms of size, but um, might be seen as low-hanging fruit for restoration. Um, so that's just a simple scenario of removing it. Much farther downstream, so now we're close to the border with Rhode Island. The Saranac Dam in Blackstone, Mass. At this point, the river has actually dipped into Rhode Island and has come back north into Mass for its final turn. Um, so this dam, a little bit taller, maybe closer to 6 to 8 feet tall, um, and kind of near Central Blackstone. We looked at two scenarios with this, or we're proposing two scenarios for this one. Um, a partial removal and a full removal. Um, this dam is really the only one we have looked at a partial removal scenario for. And the reason for that is that there's a little bit more of a historical connection between this one and local Blackstone folks. Um, and so there could be um, some justification for just keeping a segment of the dam as a historical fraction, um, while removing enough that you still are restoring the function of the river. And then farther downstream, this is actually our only dam we're looking at in this study for Rhode Island. So this is the Pratt Dam in Lincoln. So here's some helpful photos. Folks might be familiar with the tubes, which are a really dangerous location for any recreational paddlers, especially during really high flows. Um, if we're talking about pinch points, this is really textbook just like pinch point of putting the river into a really small area, which causes an acceleration in flow, backs up water on one side and creates a quick drop to get through it. So we're interested in analyzing two different scenarios. One would be just understanding if there's a version of this configuration in which the literal tubes themselves, kind of these like stone piers, could be removed. There'd still just be a bridge over it, but the theory would be widening the area for water flow would reduce the velocity and the backing up of water, so it would make it a safer area, both recreationally and also just easier for potential fish passage through it, and less of a flood risk upstream as well. And then a second scenario we're proposing would be to, still keep some sort of bridge here, but the portion of this that is a dam, um, I don't think we quite have a zoomed in picture, but basically this footbridge continues like towards the camera that took the picture. And so just widening the opening even more to absolutely eliminate any sort of restriction of water. And then our 19th and 20th scenarios for our to get to our total 20, um, just going back to some of the bridges that we were looking at before. So Sutton Street and Providence Road in Northbridge, these are some locations of known flooding, bridge overtopping. The bridges, like Steph said earlier, might actually be just in the floodplain or in the floodplain elevation. So trying to understand how could this be reconfigured, widened at least to meet, I mentioned those stream crossing standards before, so basically that means just outside of the main floodway of the river, but also potentially elevated outside of the flood elevation too. Um, and the last bridge we're also looking at is Pleasant Street in Grafton. Um, so that's another one where we understand that there's some frequent flooding. And that wraps up those 20 scenarios. So hopefully it's a little more helpful than looking at this list to actually look through the sites. Um, but definitely happy to talk through any of those if there are um, questions or comments. Um, yeah, that concludes the scenarios.
Thanks, Jonas. So from here, it's really just conversation and discussion, answering any questions, if there are other things that we haven't thought about, if you guys have any thoughts about, modifying the specific scenarios that we have here, um, adding something in or swapping one out. So just open to your feedback.
I would guess that there's one bridge in there in Uxbridge. There are two like bridges upstream from dams. One is the Route 16 one that you pointed out. The other one, which I would guess from a novice point of view has a lot of impact on hydraulics, is the one on East Hartford Avenue, and above that's an area called Rice City Pond. And there's a bridge that narrows the river quite a bit. Then beyond that is a dam, and then beyond that it sort of opens up. And this is north of Route 16. But I would,
Right up here, I think, David, is that right? Or like kind of closer to the dam itself, basically.
let's see your screen. Let's see.
Yeah, right at Route 16 there.
No, no, it's not Route 16. It's East
I mean,
Oh,
Hartford
it's
it's
Ave.
farther up.
Hartford Ave,
Yeah,
sorry.
it's further up. Yeah, it's up. It's upstream. What is that? Peter, do you think a mile maybe?
Yeah, that's the beautiful 1820 bridge, the Stone Arch Bridge,
Yeah.
but then it
It's
has a
it's
long
gorgeous
embankment.
bridge. Yeah, right. Oh, that's way up. Rice City Dam. Yeah.
Okay, that's really helpful. Yeah, we again those bridge locations I think we've kind of tossed back and forth amongst our
Hmm. Hmm.
project team. And so happy to look more at that one and see if that would be a better candidate to model.
I think one of the questions there is it the bridge that restricts it, or is it the dam?
Yes.
Or would
And
it
just
make
and
it
just below that's the a canal that's
right?
usually
Right.
full. There are the dam site, there are locks that aren't used anymore for flow control.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yes, there's a lot going on. You're right, Kate.
Yeah, there are a lot of connections here.
Yeah.
It's a quite the spot.
Mhm. Any other questions or comments that folks want to share? Thoughts?
Yeah, I've got a couple of thoughts. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm super excited about there are like two or three obstructions that may or may not even fit the definition of dam. There's a couple that are in the river where nobody except for the very few people who brave the river even know about. And I feel cautiously optimistic that we'll be able to knock out some of these low-hanging fruit um, fairly easily. I mean, they're dams that are mostly breached anyway, and so I like just from a layperson sort of thought the risk of contaminated sediment seems pretty low, and I just want to say that I'm excited. Like I'm really glad that we're doing H&H for these areas, and I can, just plant that seed to move a project forward. So there's a couple that seem really easy. And then there's a couple that seem like pie in the sky, very expensive. So I'm just feeling good about it.
Yeah, we definitely tried to have a mixture of both. The smaller ones that are maybe a little bit easier to get public support or permit or timeline to actually remove, et cetera. They don't have as many benefits to remove them. So like the Route 16 dam, for instance, but it's kind of starting that process and showing that it's possible. So we agree. Have a wide, broad array. And like I said, we met with DER to kind of talk through some of these as well and think about, you know, if we do want to pursue any of these, what would be potential funding options for each of them to do a more complete, specific feasibility study. So we have that in the back of our mind as well.
I had a question, maybe jumping the gun, maybe it's just too early to answer this. But I'm Julie Wood with the Charles River Watershed Association, and obviously a lot more familiar with the Charles than the geography here. Um, the Charles is really flat. I don't know what your guys' elevation loss is. Maybe it's okay. So this could be
Almost
totally
450 feet.
okay. Um, yeah, yeah, we're less than that. So this could be very different situation, but for any time we've had hydrology, H&H modeling of dam removals, the impacts are quite small. Like the um length of river stream that's impacted is small, the elevation changes are small. Um, it's minor. The other restoration factors are much like essentially for us fish passage is really the main kind of benefit and driver, I guess. Although, all of them, all of the water quality, etc. Do you have any sense of how big of an impact, or have you done past modeling that gives you a sense of that? Or is that just a stay tuned and we'll find out?
Um, Correct me if I'm wrong, Steph. I don't think there has been past modeling of the main stem. Um, it's an interesting comparison with the Charles because like Steph might have been kind of gesturing. It's a steeper, actually Steph, you said it's a steeper um river overall, which actually is why there's so many dams on the main stem, is it's almost like built in that you have
Right.
this like hydraulic
The
gradient
power,
that you
yeah.
can create power
Hmm.
from. Um, that probably will be beneficial in terms of making that impact small, because if you think about like uh steeper slope, like there it's actually going to back up
Yeah.
water less along that same slope. Um, and then the other factor that kind of comes into play is a lot of these dams are just really small anyway. So
Okay, yeah, that's our case too. They're just
yeah,
not that tall. Yeah.
yeah. So it shouldn't be really big areas. Of course, that's like one of the main focuses of these studies once you advance them is would other infrastructure be impacted, especially anything upstream that's in that impoundment. But for a lot of these, there actually isn't too much upstream infrastructure either. So um, that makes some of them even easier to work with.
When we
Yeah.
first when we first wanted to do this project, I basically pointed to the Charles and said, "We have X amount of dollars. How close can you get us to Charles River's water study and mapping? Because I that's really what I want is to understand where the flooding is and where that. The other thing that I think Jonas mentioned in the very, very beginning is kind of like running this modeling in sort of typical flood or typical run conditions, and then in both drought and flood scenarios to see how that changes. So we're trying to understand it, but it's a 48-mile river that we're kind of tackling all at once here. So we know that it's kind of high level for this first pass, but we really want it to be as all encompassing as we can for this step.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, this looks like you guys are gonna get a ton of useful information out of this. Yeah, so be interested to see.
Thanks, Julie. Peter?
Yeah, a kind of related question. About 10 years ago, the Upper Blackstone conducted a detailed water quality modeling when they tried to argue against their permits for phosphorus. And I remember Carla saying, and they had to hire USGS to do time of travel because that was critical to
Oh, you froze on us there, Peter. I don't know if you can hear us.
millions, if not billions,
Oh,
in water improvement.
wait,
Take out a
Peter.
dam or two, and then that would increase the flow, and you wouldn't have the dissolved oxygen problems
Mm.
downstream in Rhode Island impoundment. So I don't know if this study would support that or if it could say how much the speed of the flow is increased.
You cut out in the middle there, Peter. So tell me if I'm not getting the gist of your question, but I think the gist of your question was, yeah, like would we be able to quantify how much removing the dams will speed up the river and help improve water quality? Um, and that's not a specific thing that we are going to quantify, but it'd be pretty easy to. That's a quick add-in. One of the like very kind of like rudimentary ways would just be kind of like Julie's question, like figure out how much the impoundment of water reduces. And if you think about how much less there is just like that volume of standing water and almost like all the funky bioreactive stuff that happens in river with dissolved oxygen going down and things like that, we can do some rough estimates. And I feel like Peter might have frozen again, so I don't know if you even heard that, but hopefully.
No, I heard that. Thank you.
Oh, you did? Okay, great. Perfect. You were very still, so I was worried we lost you.
And qualitatively, we know that running water, of course, is also good to avoid a lot of aquatic invasives. So, we don't see water chestnut very frequently on the main stem, but and except behind dams. So as that water slows and it has the opportunity to grow, we're seeing it more and more behind the Fisherville Dam, for instance. That pond has just taken over with invasive water chestnut in the past couple of years. And we can see that progression very quickly and very clearly as we paddle the river each year.
Not to mention benefits for the actual like thermal quality of the
Hmm.
river too. So moving water being lower temperature.
Yeah, that's a good question though, Peter, and thinking about how we can quantify that and include it as a deliverable. Other thoughts or questions?
So as far as this study and the other project that you're working with that has more to do with water quality, are they like informing each other? Or if like the H&H study going to be used to help model the water quality or
For the 604B project?
yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so Horsley Witten is involved in both of those. Jonas, I'm not sure if that's maybe more of a Nick question.
I can dabble, although it is a slight nit question. Who, by the way, just within the past week, yeah. So for those who don't know, my sort of colleague who's also on this project, just welcomed a baby into his life, so he's on paternity leave. Um, but yes, they will talk to each other a little bit, but I think we're viewing it more as like two sides of the coin of the watershed. And so more of just like helping give a holistic understanding of what happens in the watershed and then what happens in the river.
So anytime that project needed answers or information around sort of more this quantity issue, we can take that information from here. So everything in this project is, basically public data. One other element that I don't think we mentioned is that once this is done and we have the scenarios and we have all the understanding of how the river flows in these different ways, we will make a viewer of this. I don't think it's going to be quite as fancy as the Charles River one, but we will have some sort of public viewer. All the data is going to be publicly available for download, so anyone can use it afterwards. But anytime a quantity issue is important for that quality issue, absolutely we can share.
Cool. Thank you.
Anyone else? Thoughts, questions, ideas? Okay, not hearing any. Thank you all for joining us and just kind of listening in here, and sharing all your perspectives. And this is really helpful for us. So, for next steps, we're gonna go chat internally and make sure we're good on all of those scenarios, which it sounds like we basically are. There might be a couple of questions thinking a bit more about bridges. Um, but we'll work on those modeling scenarios and we'll keep you posted, and just keep that next date on your calendar. I think it's October 21st off the top of my head, as that next steering committee meeting. So we'll send you a reminder ahead of time, but we kind of bumped that up a little bit because we're working really hard on getting some results and doing a lot of writing this summer. And we want to be able to share that draft with you in early fall, so that it can be informed by the steering committee before we finalize things. So if you ever have thoughts or questions or want to check in, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to talk to you. We're also working on updating our website right now to include some more information about what we found so far. So that will be publicly accessible. But the whole point of this is to just share information and have this baseline so that, whoever needs it can use it and have it really accessible. So, the engagement piece is really central to our work. Well, thank you all so much. And if you're interested in the access and restoration piece, we'll see you at 1 p.m. But otherwise, we'll see you in October. Take care, everybody.